Welcome to part 5 on my series where I walk you through a specific branch of my family tree and go in depth on what I know about them, what I've learned, what I haven't been able to learn, and do kind of a deep dive on tracing that specific line. And the reason that I'm doing this series and why I think it's so important is to give you folks a good understanding of how each specific family research project requires different sets of tools, and by having a good arsenal of ideas to use, you can kind of figure out what tactics need to be used for what specific kind of line. On this episode, I'm actually going to be talking about my Kushner family, who I talked about in one of the very first episodes of this show. I believe it was the 4th episode. And they're actually one that I've discovered quite a bit on and have been able to use many different tools in this specific line. So I'm happy to share that with you. I'm Yonah Paley, and I believe genealogy is fun. And on this episode, I'm going to be revisiting the ancestry of my grandmother, Joan Kushner, in order to show you how I learned about this specific family. So my grandmother Joan, who died in 2018, lived in Albany, and she was the child of Max Kushner and Sadie Lifshin. And I actually met Max and Sadie when I was a kid. I have very vague memories of meeting my great-grandparents as a young child. But one thing that I knew was that Max came from Russia. Where in Russia that was kind of a mystery to my family up until I started doing genealogy. But I believe it was my grandmother. I had asked her a while ago, and she said that she knew that he was from Vilna. And luckily, I was able to, early on in my genealogy career, to find on JewishGen a birth record for Max. He was born in 1905 to Reuben Kushner and Julia Sorokin, and thankfully, Reuben and Julia came to the United States because from this I was able to learn that the family had originally come from a city called Daugavpils in modern-day Latvia, then called Dvinsk. So when I was researching the Kushners, I had found a bunch of birth records in Vilnius, and then, you know, those records kind of mention that the family was originally from Dvinsk. As did all the immigration documents in the United States. Reuben and Julia had a total of 11 children, 4 of whom died in childhood. And from finding Reuben's grave, I was able to go one more generation back, which was to learn that his father was named Yehuda Yitzchak Kushner. Now, thankfully, through some digging on ancestry records and whatnot, I was able to find that Reuben had at least a couple of brothers. There was one who had moved to California, and then a family member told me about one who had moved to South Africa. But I wanted to know more. It seemed that nobody really could get any further back than knowing that they came from this city, and some went to South Africa, some went to America. So what I did is I paid the Latvian State Archives to do a research project for me. And this was probably one of the most productive research projects I've ever done, where essentially they went through the archives and they took all the information that I had, and they found a bunch of records for my Kushner family living in Dvinsk, including an 1875 census, which had my great-great-great-grandfather Yehuda Yitzchak Kushner and Reuben as a young child with all of his siblings, a good chunk of Yehuda Yitzchak's siblings, and it mentioned that they were the sons of Matis Kushner. And on this old census, it said that Matis, his father, was named Nisan. So now from pretty much nothing, from knowing just a little bit about my great-grandfather, over a period of a few years, I was able to take this generation back to, I believe, my fifth great-grandfather, which would be Nisan Kushner. And it gets even better because I was starting to get into DNA around that time, and I had luckily matched with somebody in France who was descended from Matis Kushner, as it turns out. And I reached out to them and learned about their branch of the family, who unfortunately had been killed in the Holocaust. They were deported from France to Auschwitz. And Samuel Kushner, or Shmuel, Moshe Shmuel, as his name was, he was a brother of Yehuda Yitzchak. But I was able to connect via DNA with some of his relatives. And then that kind of set me on this chain reaction where, using this DNA match and using these records from the archives, I was able to learn what happened to a lot of Yehuda Yitzchak's siblings. And actually, as of 2021, the Kushner line of my family is one of the most well fleshed out branches of my family tree. So it's not perfect. There are still things that I don't know about them. I'm hopeful that someday I could probably take back the generation maybe one more, because the oldest record I've got is 1875, and the archives just didn't have anything further back for my family. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's something else out there that eventually crops up, and when it does, I've already gotten pretty far back on this line, but it would be nice to be able to connect more of the uncles and aunts and cousins, and I'm sure there are definitely sections of the family that moved to other parts of the world. This branch of the family also moved all over the place. So I've got relatives from my Kushner line in France, South Africa, some who had moved to Azerbaijan, to Russia, to the United States, and different parts of the United States. So this family is quite big, quite diverse, and yeah, I'm really pleased that I was able to learn a lot about them. Now, the thing about the last name Kushner is that because it means a furrier, it's a profession name, so Kushners kind of crop up all over the place in Eastern Europe. So just because two people have the last name Kushner makes it highly unlikely that they're related. Even within Daugavpils or Dvinsk, there are a bunch of Kushner families, and I don't know if all of them are related to one another, just because it was a pretty big city and it's a pretty common last name. But for the most part, whenever I find a Kushner from that specific city, there's a good chance that I'm going to be able to link them into somebody on my family tree. And that wraps up this episode. If you liked it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. As always, I'm looking forward to bringing you more videos about famous Jews, as well as tips and tricks that you can use in your own genealogy research. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll get you next time.